Thank you. Good morning. It's really good to be here. I'm feeling privileged to be the first speaker because it means as soon as I'm off the stage, I'm done for the rest of the conference and I can listen to all the rest of the great speakers. I come from Vancouver. Actually, originally I live in New York City, so the walk over here to this venue was like a liquid embrace of my heart because this is the type of weather that we normally have in Vancouver. I'm going to spend some time talking about maybe the most frequently used word that's going to be at this conference, and maybe one of the most frequently used words in news media and in general cultural discussion over the last few years, which is data. But I was actually thinking last night about a friend of mine, Natalie Miebach, who is an artist from Massachusetts. This is one of her sculptures. These are handmade sculptures that are made from data. So they're data visualization representations that exist in space and are made from everyday objects. And Natalie came to my class last year and she asked a question to my students, which has been sitting in my head, which is, are we being too polite with data? And so I decided that what I would do for 40 minutes here with you is to abuse this term a little bit. I want to make it work for us. I want to change maybe our perceptions of what it means and what it can mean, and sort of fundamentally break some rules that we have laid down about what data is. So the first thing I'd like to do with data is to release it from one of its most fundamental constraints, which is this idea of objectivity. And I'd like to start by placing data into the subjective. And I spend a lot of time on airplanes, and a good metaphor, I think, for the lived experience of data is air travel. And I think that it's a good metaphor for a couple of reasons. First of all, the minute I cross that security line in the airport, I lose agency. I'm no longer making my own choices. I'm doing what I'm told. I'm being touched in inappropriate places, and a lot of my freedoms are being removed from me. But the second thing is that when I'm part of the air travel system, I'm part of a system that is almost unimaginably complicated. And this visualization that you're seeing behind me is every flight landing and taking off across the world. And the pulse that you start to see is a 15-minute interval because most of these flights are leaving on those 15-minute marks. So when you're on your plane, you are in fact one of more than 1 million people in the air. And it's something that is so vast that we really can't comprehend it. So this combination of complexity and a lack of control, I think, is the typical lived experience of data for the average person. And I want to keep that in our heads as we move forward. We should be thinking not only about what data is, but what is the experience of data? What does it feel like to live inside of this new data world? In 2009, I had the chance to work with a network scientist named Laszlo Barabashi. I was actually working for the Wired magazine in the UK. David Rowan, who is the editor there, had extended an invitation to me to come in and take care of a 2-page spread in the magazine every month, which had the unfortunate title of Info Porn. And so every month I got to think about what I would put in that space. And my favorite project was this collaboration with Laszlo Barabashi. So Laszlo had been studying the idea of human mobility. How can we predict how people are moving? And he'd come upon a really staggeringly amazing data set. It was every subscriber to a major European telecom in one of the biggest countries in Europe. I can't tell you what that country is. And so we had this incredible data set of where people were, who they were calling, and where they were calling from. And so the first thing I did was I plotted this on a graph, as we want to do with data. This is a really boring graph, but there's some fundamentally interesting things. This is a histogram, so this is everybody in the data set. That person on the left-hand side is the one who speaks the most on their phone in a week. That's 84 hours spent on the phone in the week. And then everybody else trails off towards this proverbial long tail, where on the right-hand side, we're actually only people who are text messaging. Anyways, this is a terrible graphic, and if I had showed it to David, he would have shown me the door. And so I applied this principle that I use a lot in data visualization, which is this idea of the ooh-ah principle. So the ooh-ah principle is really fundamentally simple. When I'm working on something in the data visualization area, I want first to attract people's attention who might not otherwise pay attention. So this is the ooh thing, ooh. And then I want to show them something that they've never seen before and have them learn something, ah. And so the best work that I do, I think, is where that balance between ooh and ah is held in check. And so I took the graphs that you saw a second ago and I stylized them into these 3D cell phone towers, which is just showing people that this is a lot of data, and that's what's sat on the left-hand side of the page. But it's actually the right-hand side of the page that I care about. That was the left-hand side of the page. The right-hand side of the page, I stumbled upon this idea to make these little cubes, which I called mobility maps. And what a mobility map shows is where a person travels in a specific point in area of time. So this is 4 days, and this person is going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between two locations. So this is a dedicated European commuter who's going home, work, home, work, home, work. And as it turned out, we could take that data with everybody in the data set. There was 10,000 people who had volunteered their geographic data. And so we could see this pattern. And this was a turning point for me in my work, because up to this point, I really hadn't understood that this is one of the things that data can do. It can leave a kind of trail of our lives which can be reeled back up and made sense of. And so for the next 3 years, my work really focused on this idea. How can we make unintentional things? How can we make intentional things from unintentional data? So I was up late last night, and I used Twitter's search tool, and I looked for people who had just tweeted that they had landed in Manchester. So there's 3 tweets that I pulled in no particular order. I was going to say, I don't know who Phil Thompson is, but I Googled it, so now I do know who Phil Thompson is. And these are the types of tweets that you get when you search for this type of phrase. They're these quotidian tweets that are just people sharing a trivial moment in their lives, although maybe not so much in Manchester or in Vancouver, but in other cities like Las Vegas or Hawaii, these tends to be these thinly veiled show-off tweets. And so I made a project from these tweets in 2009, again, called Just Landed, in which I'm looking at all of these tweets that have happened over 36 hours on Twitter, where people have said either I've just landed in or I've just arrived in. And because I know where they're going, they just told me, because I know where they come from, because that's in their Twitter profile, I can actually assemble a map of travel patterns from people on Twitter. And this was a proof of concept in 2009, because there was 300 people on Twitter. Now there's many, 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 many more. And so this could actually be used to give us a very, very good model that this project came out of a collaboration with an epidemiologist. So we could use this to model how people are traveling and maybe piggyback on that to find out how diseases spread. This is a companion project, also from 2009, called Good Morning. This is everybody on Twitter saying good morning one day in August. So the green dots are people who wake up early. The red dots are people who wake up late. And so you can see this pattern. And this is a triviality, but it's a fun one. And what's interesting here, though, is that, of course, we would have never been able to see this until this data was available to us. We know that everyone wakes up around the world. This is not exciting evidence of any kind, but it was the ability to see something that we'd never had the chance to see before. So one of the fundamental shifts that has happened with data involves how we use it and how we get it. And so the 3 projects that I've shown you a second ago, or last few minutes, are all about me using the Twitter API or another data source to get data from people without those people knowing that I'm using their data. But actually, this fundamentally goes against what the word data means. So the word data comes from a Latin root, datum, which which means a given. And you might remember this phrase from math class, and in school, where I look at an equation, there are some things that are unknown in an equation, and then there's other things like numbers that are givens. There are things that are given to us to understand the system. So one of the things that I think is very interesting is that data is rarely given anymore. It is almost always taken. So we have this shift from data to capta. We can think about these things that I'm using less as things that are freely given and more of things that I'm taking from people. Now, in the case of the Twitter API, this is a public API, so I checked a little box and I said that anybody can use this data. But there's a lack of permission there, which I find fundamentally unsettling. And almost everything that we do with data, whether it be in a city, in a smart city initiative, or in a research lab, or in an art studio, almost everything we're doing is done in this fashion, without permission. And I started to become very fascinated about this in about 2011. So I don't know if you remember this story, but it was discovered that your iPhone or your iDevice was tracking location data, and it was storing it on your machine insecurely. And so what that meant is that if I knew that you had an iPhone, and I had access to your computer, I could find a file on your computer that told me where you've been in pretty good detail for the whole time that you've owned that device. So you only have to say the words jealous and spouse together to understand how this could cause problems. So at the New York Times R&D lab where I worked, and you're going to hear some really brilliant people from the R&D lab coming up in a moment, a few of us collaborated on a project. Matt Baji, who's sitting over here, Jake Poroway and Brian House, and I collaborated on a project called Open Paths. And the idea was that we could take this data that was sitting freely somewhere on your computer, and we could give it to people like Laszlo Berebashi, who actually could use that data to do something other than whatever weird, nefarious things Apple was doing with that data. So we developed this tool called Open Paths, and Open Paths has had a long life and a healthy development cycle, and it's ended up to be this website and a series of tools that can be installed on your smartphone. So I would, everyone in the room, you can go and install Open Paths when you get home, or in the break, and what it does is just something very simple. It tracks your location data. So almost every app on your phone is doing the same thing. It's tracking your location data. The difference between OpenPaths and all those other apps is that you get access to the data, first of all, fundamentally. Second of all, nobody else does. The data is stored encrypted on our servers, so nobody can have access to this data unless you give them implicit permission to get it. And this is actually, the results are simple. You can just see where you've been. We're not giving you anything miraculous here, but actually it's a really fun experience. And I usually ask people to install it for 3 weeks and forget about it. And then after that 3 weeks, come to the website and you'll be able to replay that 3 weeks of your life. And so the fundamental reason why we're doing this is to give people an idea of what type of data they're giving up on an everyday basis, but also to start thinking about what are some useful things that we could find out as individuals about this data that we're creating. And so core to this is this idea of data ownership. Data is not, as again, this give and taken thing. Data is not something that we own and we give. It's something that is taken from us. So how can we turn that around and make it fundamentally something that, again, we give to people? In some ways, what we're trying to do is reclaim the definition of data of how it existed in the first place. In tandem to that, with the ability to give data comes the potential for data philanthropy, because the idea that I can actually give this data to who I choose to give the data. And so built into OpenPass is a system where researchers can apply and an email gets sent out to our user base, and you can say, yes, I want to help with this project, or no, I don't want to help with this project. And you can kind of give your data freely. There's a very interesting thing happening about permission in data, and this has been happening for a long time. Pretty much the only time that we grant permission is when we see something like this. And this is called a third-party permission dialogue, and what it's asking for is a software developer asking to use your data. So it's interesting that third parties are granted access to the data more than the first party is. We don't actually, as the first party, get to use that data very much at all. As an artist, I'm really interested in this idea of how can we foster people to have a more personal relationship with their data. And it goes to our cultural understanding of that word, that this may seem weird to you, the idea of having a personal relationship with data, but I actually don't think it's that weird at all. So this is a map that Brian House made, who is the lead researcher on OpenPass, and this shows what he calls his meaningful locations in New York City. So it's his house, it's his work, it's the place where he practices with his band, it's where his girlfriend lives, it's the bar that he goes on Fridays. This is all encapsulated in the data. So if you ran this program, you would have a different map of meaningful locations, but you wouldn't have to do anything. You could just ask for that map to be rendered. And all of us in this room have a different map of meaningful locations that's contained in the data that we're giving to advertisers on a daily basis. So how can we turn that around, and how can we understand these things and maybe find some meaning from them? So this is a visualization that I made, a composition that I made, which is very different. So the arrows, they're a little hard to see on the screen, they're direction vectors. So the ones that go up are going north, and the ones that go down are going south. And this is a clock on its side, so this little tuft is me waking up in the morning. At the time when I worked at the Times, I would go to work northwest. So that's me going to work, and then I'm at work a little bit. That little guy at the top is lunchtime, and then the afternoon, and then I was relatively new to New York City, so I would never go home, lots of scattered directions. And then you can see some stumbling in the late evening as I come back home. And the idea of this composition was, can we make an object from data that was an aesthetic object that people might want to put on their wall? And I had this dream that somebody would put this on their wall, and before they went to bed at night, they would look up at it and they would say, "Good night, data." Because it's a record of myself. And one of the reasons why we're so used to giving data, and I think one of the reasons we so freely give it or have it taken from us, is because we see it as just a numerical record. So this is what the data looks like in the visualization you just saw. Here are 3 as my data points. And these data points are quote unquote just numbers, but this number is my first data point in New York City. I lived in Vancouver for 27 years. This is my first moment stepping off the plane in LaGuardia Airport. Right, that evening I had a spicy Thai noodle dish at this restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue with a crisp glass of Riesling. I would have forgotten that completely if it weren't for this data point. My girlfriend Nora and I have been together for almost 4 years. This is the very moment that I met her as she walked down the hallway of my apartment building. And I have this idea that one day I'll sit a grandchild on my lap and I will show them this as a record of this thing. And again, we laugh because our understanding of data is different from that. But we're used to showing our children photographs, and a photograph is a record of a moment. This is also a record of a moment. It's a way to prove, it's a piece of evidence to prove to our grandchildren that this happened. That's what a photograph is. It's a way for us to speak about the past. So I have a studio in New York City called the Office for Creative Research, and we are fundamentally engaged with this idea of changing the way that we engage with data, doing things with data that may, to some people, seem obscene. Not maybe to most of you in this room. Do you remember the flashlight app? These don't exist anymore because all the phones have LEDs on them, but do you remember these? They would turn the phone white and you could find things. So these were some of the most popular apps in this app store because they were useful. But one of the things I think people don't understand about flashlight apps is that most of them are free, and almost all of them, when you installed them, they would ask for your location data. Why does a flashlight app need your location data? And this is a peak, one of the only peaks that people get into this fundamentally gigantic and influential system that lays underneath all of this, which is web advertising. So the flashlight app wants to know where you live because it wants to know a little bit more about you so that it can give you a better ad the next time you open your web browser. And so this is what almost all of the apps on your phone do right now. They're tracking, they know you're here at Manchester Town Hall, and that's giving them a piece of information that they can later use to hopefully target you a better advertisement. It's this gigantic system that underlies a lot of the economy that behind the web. So I have a student, I teach a class called Data Art, in ITP, which is a program at NYU in New York City. I have a student named Julia Irwin who made this project last year called Cookie Jar. And the idea here is really great that you can take a set of web ads. So these are web ads on the right, and then you could give those web ads to strangers and ask them to write a profile about the person, and you would get a result out of it. So Julia presented this project in my class, and at the time I was working on the beginnings of a project called Floodwatch, which is I'm going to talk about in more detail, but what Floodwatch allows you to do is it allows you to gather ads at a huge magnitude. So I gathered about 1,000, this is actually 1,200 ads from my ad stream, and I asked strangers to write about them as well using Julia's idea, and the results are quite interesting. It gives us a peek into something, which is what do advertisers think they know about us? And so what is this represented identity that's built up from these data trails that we're leaving behind? And for me, it was really interesting because my advertisements show that I'm in my 20s and I play games and I live alone. None of those three things are true, by the way. And I think all of us, we have these second identities, these second advertisement identities that we don't actually get to see. So very much like OpenPath, the idea of this project was to give the user an ability to see what the advertisers know about them. So Floodwatch rather is a browser plugin. You can install it, please install it. And it runs in Chrome, and it'll just sit in the background and count every ad that you see and store a little image of that ad. And so you can go back at any time and you can see a history of your advertisements. So this is really an attempt to see something which is otherwise invisible. And so we're working on a second mode right now which allows you to compare yourself to either the average user or the average male user or the average female user or the average 20-year-old user or the average user from the South in America or the average user from New York City. So you can understand what are the types of advertisements that advertisers are only showing to you, and are there things in that practice that make you unsettled or uncomfortable? Because we actually know that there are discriminatory practices happening in advertising. And the line between targeted ads and discriminatory ads is very fine. If an advertiser is showing me advertisements for glasses because they know I wear glasses, that's okay. But if there was a housing development being built in Manchester and they were only targeting their ads to a certain racial group, that's a discriminatory act, and it's illegal. But advertisers can get away with it right now because there's no control over this. There's no way to understand what's happening. So the fundamental idea behind Floodwatch, and this is voluntary, by the way, it's opt-in, is that you can opt in to donate your data to researchers. And so what we're hoping to gather is the world's largest data set on advertising activity, and then just not give it to the advertisers. Like, they cannot have the data to try to advocate for and facilitate a collective action, to get people to be able to push back against this discriminatory practice, because right now we can't push back against it because we have no evidence, right? So I want to beat data to death a little bit more, the word here, but I want to take advantage of something that's already happened with data. There may be some pedants in the room who are already getting itchy when I was using data in the singular and not in the plural, but something has happened to the word data over the last few years, and then that is that it's in its common usage, it's gone from being a plural noun to becoming a mass noun. And so mass nouns are pretty fun. Like, there's lots of great mass nouns, right? These are all things that we can't pluralize, right? So you don't have like one blood or two blood or three blood. You just have blood. These are things that represent not an identifiable number of things, but rather a kind of ambiguous, larger scale group. And so some of the work that we've been pursuing lately, including Floodwatch, which I just showed you, is about not engaging particularly with the individual user, but instead engaging with the collective, to try to understand about how as a collective can we understand things, can we engage with things, can we gain meaning from them. So last year I had the chance to work with a writer named Teju Cole, and Teju is a really fantastic writer, and he's been one of I think he's the person who's maybe used Twitter the best as a writer, and if you haven't had a chance to go through his Twitter stream, you should. It's just at Teju Cole. And last year we worked on a project together. It was a lightning project. We did it in 3 days called Time of the Game. And what it was a collective record of the World Cup final. And what Teju asked is he asked everybody who was following him on Twitter to take a photograph of their television screen and to tag it with Time of the Game along with the minute in which that photograph was taken. And the result is this collectively authored thing which allows us to understand the worldwide experience of watching the World Cup. And it's a little washed out here. But the idea is that the television is always centered in the middle. So I can go to Brooklyn and I can see all of the photographs that were taken in Brooklyn during the World Cup. You can't really see it, but there's this is like my favorite Brooklyn joke ever. Those are fixed gear bicycles leaning against a craft beer bar. Like when I saw this, I was like, really, Brooklyn? That's it is. That is Brooklyn. So we're actually very pleased that the National Football Museum in Manchester will be putting this project into their collection as a way to understand kind of what this global experience of football is. And we had a lot of time putting this together. I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here to show you how we did this, because I think this was a nice combination of some technical wizardry and just some stubborn get-it-donedness. So the trick here was, how do we align these photographs on the television? And there are a lot of very clever things we could do with computer vision here, but as it turned out, it was actually pretty tricky because the TVs were often obscured. They were showing sometimes dark content, sometimes bright content. It was quite hard to identify where the object is. So we tried a few times to be really clever, because that's what you want. You want to be able to say, and then we use computer vision and machine learning to discover. But what we actually ended up doing is Mario Klingemann, who's a great friend of mine, built this little web tool, and the way that it works is that I can just trace the screen over here, and when I'm finished tracing the screen over there, the screen on the right will show me the modified version of it, and then if I'm happy with it, I can just kind of press the done button and it'll be added to the list. And so I spent a very long time in the last hours of this project, like trace to get this all together. Teju speaks, I don't know, an order of magnitude more eloquently than me about this project. And he talks about the idea of this project as being a representation of public space, or rather public time, in the same way we would consider this to be a public space. You know, the watching of the World Cup is one of those things that really is fundamentally public time. We're doing the same thing in the same time period around the world. And I love this last sentence of this quote where he says, under the guise of football, we actually testify to each other's existence. And so we're really thinking, and Moritz is going to show you some great projects thinking around this area as well, about how can we build projects that don't speak only about the individual experience, but also are talking about a collective experience. The other thing that has fundamentally changed, there are many, about data is that the distance between it and humans has gotten larger. And what I'm talking about here is we can actually have a very, very easy definition of data, which is that data are measurements of something. Right? So it's a human artifact. Data are human artifacts, and it used to be that this connection between the measurement and the thing was much tighter, and technology mainly has allowed it to get a lot wider. So let me give you an example for what I mean here. This is a diagram by Jacob Moreno. Jacob Moreno was a sociologist actually working in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. And what he was trying to investigate was social relationships. So what you see here is you see a map of a 4th grade classroom. On the left-hand side, the triangles are boys. On the right-hand side, the circles are girls. And every line is an interaction between those students. There's some like brave prepubescent crossing happening across here. But I like this thing not only because it's one of the first examples of a visualization of a social network, But because it also, think about how this happened, right? So there's a classroom, and then there's a scientist who comes and sits in that classroom. I like to think they had a white coat on, but maybe they didn't. Right? They sit in the corner of this classroom, and they're watching humans interact. They're watching these people, and they're taking records. That's how it used to work. We can do much, much, much vastly more amazing things now with social data. But we don't do them that way. We don't sit in the classroom with children. We access an API. I give an API my API key, and out comes the data. I don't actually have to know anything about the people that I'm studying, let alone look them in the eye. Right? So this change is what facilitates and what allows us to get away with things like the Facebook study, where they're like, I'm going to go and I'm going to study 1 billion users or however many users I want without their permission, and I can get away with it because that distance has been removed. And not necessarily always a bad thing, but what it does is it allows us a convenient space for unethical activity to happen, because I'm not presented with the actual people who are part of the systems that I'm working in. So one of the fundamental ideas that we try to think about is, how do we reduce that distance? How do we reduce that metaphorical distance that's between us and data? And so here's the problem. So we work on a lot of projects that involve large data sets. This is the entire permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan. It's 148,000 rows. And so how do you make humanness out of that? How do you extract something out of that that will convince people that data doesn't look like this, right? This is the last thing we want to do, is be like, here's the collection. Because the collection, of course, is not this. The collection is a record of the artworks, the artists, where they were hung, what material was used, what was lost, what was found, what has been repaired. There are all these stories that lurk within this data. And so one of the first approaches we often use with these things is we try to think about the query, the database query, as a creative instrument. How can we use that query, those queries, to find poetry or to find things within this data set? So we actually have been artists in residence at MoMA for 18 months, and we've been doing these exact things. So this is an example of how we can use queries. So this is we call this a query chain. So this is a piece called Girl. There are a lot of pieces called Girl in the MoMA collection. And then we're asking for the next longest piece that matches one word, so that the next one is Gainsborough Girl. And then we look for a longer one that matches as many words as possible and kind of go through that. And so we get these kind of poems written out of the data set, which allow us to understand a little bit about what are the types of titles, how are they related. And so I can run that query again and again and again and again and again and again and again, and I get different results every time. And what I like about this one, and this ended up being part of the final piece, which I'm going to show you, well, the first try at the final piece, which I'm going to show you in a minute, is that it allows these titles and these artworks to be together with other ones that have something, they have something in common, but they may never be hung together by a curator. So it's I imagine this as being the kind of mixer where you get a bunch of people together who never get to hang out, and they're like, hey, I've got Girl in my title too. But because one was from 1911 and the other one was from 1978, they were never allowed to hang out together. So we're trying to construct these methods to move through the data set that maybe give us some insight that we would not have been able to see before. We can do other things. I can search for the F word in the titles. These ones are all fantastic. Leave that slide up for a second for you to read it, because they're really good. But then we can use more advanced queries that maybe give us insight into the politics of the data set itself. So Mark Hansen, who is one of the co-founders of my company, and he's a statistician and the most brilliant person I've ever met at asking interesting questions about data. And so the question that he asked of the data set was, what is the most common first name of artists who has work collected by MoMA? There are 200 Johns. The next common names are Robert, David, and Paul. So the idea, I haven't told you this part yet, is that what we're doing at MoMA is we're creating a series of performances with an experimental theater group called the Elevator Repair Service. And the Elevator Repair Service is very famous for performing things that are otherwise considered unperformable. And so we've asked them to work with us to perform the database. We perform it using these kinds of structures. So this is this data set performed.
Boy.
John, Robert, David, Paul, William, Richard, Peter, Charles, Michael, James, George, Jean, Hans, Thomas, Walter, Edward, Jan, Joseph, Martin, Mark, Frank, Louis, Alfred, Max, Otto, Stephen, Jack, Alexander, Henry, Jose, Carl, Andre, Henri, Arthur, Daniel, Harry, Pierre, Roger, Albert, Bruce, Carl,
Mary,
Philip, Bill, Fritz, Jim, Alex,
Barbara,
Bob,
Joan,
Juan, Tom, Antonio, Bernard, Kenneth, Roberto, Victor, Alan, Boris, Christian, Mario, Werner, Anthony, Dan, Jonathan, Marcel,
Maria,
Chris, Christopher, Eric, Joseph,
Susan,
Alexander, Ernst, Herbert, Larry, Luis, Mark, Morris, Nikolai, Sam, Tony, Carlos, Donald, Francis, Franz, Georg, George, Jacques, Joe, Ken, Vladimir, Ben, Dennis,
Elizabeth,
Yvonne, Keith,
Nancy,
Norman, Renee, Stanley,
Ann,
Bruno, Don, Douglas, Herman, Lee, Nicholas, Ralph, Rudolph, Stephen, Terry, Adam, Adolf, Carlo,
Anna,
Ed, Ernest, Fernando, Frederick, Gary, Howard, Hugo,
Jane,
Johannes, Jules, Matthew, Patrick, Steve, Tim, Wolfgang,
Alice,
Alan, Barry, Eduardo, Emilio, Eugene, Eugene, Fred, Gerald, Gerhard, Gordon, Harold, Joel, Leo, Raymond, Roman, Alberto, Alexei, Andrew, Arnold, Brian,
Helen,
Jerry, Jorge, Marcus, Michael, Miguel, Oscar, Paolo, Raphael, Ray, Roland, Rolf, Sergei, Alfredo, Anton, Eric, Gabriel, Guy.
Boy.
So I love that example because there are lots of ways we could show that data set. We could show it as a list. We could plot the female names and the male names as a bubble chart. But the reading of the names provides something which none of those things actually give to us. They remind us this sort of role that names play in our culture, but they also, it feels like a roll call. The tension that's created by the female actors having to sort of get the female names into the stream of male artists, I think is a good metaphor for maybe what it must have felt like to be a female artist in the modern art era of the 1930s. But it also, this whole thing is us trying to break the fundamental rule of data, which is that data are created to be operated on. They're created to be computed, and that we should not be used them for frivolous purpose. So our question is, what can data not be performed? Can they not one day off a week to do something which is more fun than to be in a scatter plot? And so we live in this very deeply conservative world of data in which we are told that there are specific rules in which these things can be used. And it is actually a very religious thing. And if there is a pontiff, it's Edward Tufte, who speaks in language like this when he describes data, that the beauty in a visualization is only the byproduct of the truth and the goodness of information. And when I read this quote, I was reminded of something that I had actually just been reading about, and it's shockingly coincidental that I'm in this space because this is a quote by Augustus Pugin, who was sort of responsible for the Gothic revival in Britain, and uses almost the same language to describe the way that buildings should be created, that buildings should be created such that everything has a purpose, and that everything, there's this sort of puritanical approach here that's like everything must fundamentally have a use and a purpose. At the Office for Creative Research, we've just engaged on a multi-year project where we're writing and creating a film based on Jane Jacobs and how her thinking about urbanism can be mapped to our thinking about data. And one of the things that that Jane Jacobs was a big advocate against was this idea of rationalist city planning, that we could look at the city as something that's away from us, and we could make decisions based on it from afar. And I think we're making the same mistakes with data. We're taking this rationalist approach where we're looking at the city and other things as if we are at some higher, on some higher plane. And Jane Jacobs' biggest argument was, let's get into the cities to think about the cities. And I think we have to do the same thing. We have to get into the data sets and the systems where the data comes from before we can make any type of useful decisions. I want to end by breaking data one more time. And I want to fundamentally break data. Data as the noun, and I want to ask us to consider what would data mean as a verb. I data you, you data me, they data us, and maybe most fundamentally, we all data together. And if I could print a t-shirt from the talk, it would say, either we all data together, or my favorite title from the MoMA list. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.